When Donald Trump secured the U.S. presidency, it sent shockwaves through the political and economic landscape. His leadership promised a drastic shift, particularly in how America handled global trade. Many braced for impact, uncertain of what his policies would mean for businesses, workers, and international relations. One of the most talked about aspects of his economic strategy was a bold proposal, imposing a steep 25% tariff on imports from Canada and Mexico. This wasn't just about everyday goods. It included crude oil, a resource that played a crucial role in America's energy supply. Both countries were among the U.S.'s largest oil suppliers, making this move a high-stakes gamble. The goal? To protect American industries and correct what Trump saw as unfair trade deals. By making foreign goods more expensive, he hoped to encourage companies to buy and produce more within the U.S. But while his supporters applauded this America First approach, others sounded the alarm. What would happen if Canada and Mexico retaliated with their own tariffs? How would this impact industries that depended on international trade? And what about consumers? Would they end up paying higher prices at the gas pump and grocery stores? The uncertainty left economists, business leaders, and even everyday citizens on edge. Then came the moment of truth. Shortly after taking office, Trump reaffirmed his commitment, setting an official date, February 1st. The tariffs weren't just a possibility anymore, they were happening. Businesses had mere days to prepare for the fallout, and trading partners scrambled to respond. But that wasn't the only major change coming out of the White House. On the very first day of his presidency, Trump unleashed a flurry of executive orders. Among them was one of the most controversial decisions of his early tenure, reinstating more than 8,000 military members who had been discharged for refusing the COVID-19 vaccine. For those affected, it was a stunning reversal. Many had lost their careers, benefits, and financial stability due to their decision to reject the vaccine. Now, not only were they being welcomed back into service, but they were also promised back pay for the time they had been out. To Trump's supporters, this was a victory for personal freedom and a rejection of government overreach. They argued that service members should never have been forced to choose between their careers and their medical choices. However, critics saw it differently. They warned that this move could weaken military health protocols, potentially opening the door for future challenges to mandatory vaccines. After all, the military had long required service members to receive various vaccinations, from smallpox to anthrax, to maintain combat readiness and protect troops from outbreaks. Could this decision set a dangerous precedent, making it harder to enforce health policies in the future? As debates raged on, one thing was clear. Trump's presidency was shaping up to be just as disruptive as many had predicted. When Donald Trump stepped into the Oval Office, he wasted no time making big, bold moves, especially on immigration, the environment, and global alliances. To crack down on illegal crossings, drug smuggling, and human trafficking, he ordered troops to patrol the U.S.-Mexico border. But that wasn't all. He went even further by officially labeling Mexican drug cartels as foreign terrorist groups. His supporters saw this as a strong step to tackle crime, but others worried it could lead to more tension with Mexico and turn the border into a militarized zone. Meanwhile, Trump also took a sharp turn when it came to environmental policy. He pulled the U.S. out of the Paris Climate Agreement, arguing that it put too many restrictions on American businesses. He also rolled back limits on fossil fuel drilling and put a stop to new offshore wind farm projects. While business leaders welcomed these changes, environmentalists warned that they could set back efforts to combat climate change and slow down the transition to cleaner energy. But his policy shakeups didn't stop there. Trump also reversed several initiatives aimed at promoting diversity and inclusion, dismantling efforts from the previous administration. In another controversial decision, he pushed for strict definitions of gender in federal policies, limiting recognition of non-binary and transgender identities. Supporters claimed this restored traditional values, while critics called it a step backward for civil rights. And then came one of his biggest international moves. Trump pulled the U.S. out of the World Health Organization. Frustrated with how the agency handled the COVID-19 pandemic, he argued that American taxpayers shouldn't fund an organization he believed had failed to provide clear leadership during a global crisis. Public health experts, however, feared this decision would weaken global cooperation in fighting future pandemics. On the economic front, Trump turned his attention to trade. He proposed steep tariffs on goods coming from Canada, a decision that sparked immediate concern. Since Canada and Mexico supply over half of America's crude oil, many worried that retaliatory tariffs could hurt businesses and drive up energy costs. If both sides started hitting each other with trade penalties, it could create a ripple effect that impacted jobs, prices, and economic stability. When Donald Trump took office, he wasted no time making sweeping changes to national security, trade, and foreign policy. One of his most aggressive moves was tightening border control. To combat illegal immigration, drug trafficking, and human smuggling, he ordered military forces to patrol the U.S.-Mexico border. He also took an unprecedented step by officially designating Mexican drug cartels as terrorist organizations, a move that some saw as necessary but others feared could escalate tensions with Mexico. But security wasn't the only area Trump targeted. Trade was another major focus, especially when it came to America's biggest economic partners, Canada and Mexico. His proposed tariffs on imports from both countries sent shockwaves through the business world. The most alarming part? It directly affected the U.S.'s energy supply. Canada alone supplies more than half of the crude oil the U.S. imports, pumping in nearly 3.8 million barrels per day. Mexico follows as the second largest provider, delivering billions of dollars worth of heavy crude annually to American refineries. If Trump's tariffs went into effect, this delicate supply chain could be thrown into chaos, leading to skyrocketing energy prices for American households and businesses alike. Beyond the financial hit, these tariffs threatened the economic ties that held the region together under the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA. Canada and Mexico weren't about to sit back and take the hit. They immediately began considering ways to fight back. Canadian officials weighed several countermeasures, including cutting off oil exports to the U.S., a move that could rattle energy markets and leave American refineries scrambling for alternatives. In Ontario, Premier Doug Ford even suggested using electricity exports as leverage, potentially cutting power to U.S. states like Michigan and Wisconsin, which rely on Canadian energy. Meanwhile, in Alberta, the heart of Canada's oil industry, Premier Danielle Smith warned that halting crude oil exports could backfire. Alberta depends on the U.S. market, and such a drastic move could put thousands of Canadian jobs at risk, causing economic turmoil within the province. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau took a more cautious approach. Instead of immediate retaliation, he called for a measured response, aiming to strike a balance between protecting Canada's economic interests and avoiding an all-out trade war. His government explored alternative tactics, such as placing targeted tariffs on U.S. goods to pressure Washington without disrupting essential industries. When tensions over trade erupted between the U.S. and its closest allies, Canada found itself at the center of the storm. In response to new tariff threats, Canadian leaders scrambled to shield their economy from potential damage. Some, like opposition leader Pierre Poilievre, pushed for expanding trade relationships beyond the U.S. to soften the blow. Others, including Ontario Premier Doug Ford, took a more symbolic approach. He was spotted wearing a "Canada is not for sale" hat during a meeting with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, a gesture that quickly became a rallying cry across the country. The message was clear: Canada wouldn't back down. But this wasn't just about words or symbols. Canadian officials explored countermeasures, including tariffs on key U.S. exports like steel, aluminum, and even orange juice. The goal? To send a strong message without escalating tensions unnecessarily. Meanwhile, Ford called a snap election, hoping to secure voter support for his economic strategy. The stakes were high, and political leaders across party lines recognized the urgency of the moment. Poilievre, taking a hardline stance, promised direct retaliation if the U.S. moved forward with its tariffs. He warned that these trade restrictions wouldn't just hurt Canada, they'd have a ripple effect, damaging both economies. His firm stance resonated with many Canadians who saw the tariffs as an unfair attack on their country's industries. Public reaction was swift. Thousands of Canadians ordered "Canada is not for sale" merchandise, turning the campaign into a nationwide movement. Social media erupted with calls to boycott American goods, and protests sprang up across major cities. Financial markets took notice too. The Canadian dollar, known as the loonie, showed unexpected resilience, climbing 0.2% against the US dollar. This signaled that investors weren't entirely convinced the tariffs would go through. At the same time, oil prices in Canada saw a modest increase, reflecting uncertainty in the energy market. Perhaps most notably, Canada's usual political divisions seemed to disappear, at least temporarily. Premiers from Alberta, Ontario, and Quebec all stood behind the federal government, backing strong countermeasures. Their united front underscored just how serious the situation had become. If Canada retaliated by cutting off oil exports, the consequences could be severe for both sides. The U.S. depended on Canadian crude to keep energy costs low, especially in states like Michigan, Minnesota, and Wisconsin. Any disruption in supply would likely send prices soaring, affecting millions of American consumers and businesses. At the same time, pulling back on oil exports would also come at a cost for Canada. Alberta, the heart of the nation's oil industry, relied heavily on American buyers. A sudden reduction in trade could slow economic growth, lead to job losses, and strain provincial budgets. It was a delicate balancing act, one that required careful calculation. Rather than risk an energy crisis, Canadian officials considered a different strategy: targeted tariffs on U.S. products. This approach mirrored their 2018 response to American trade restrictions, when Canada slapped duties on items like bourbon, steel, and orange juice. Another option? Diversifying energy exports. Canada had already been investing in new infrastructure projects, such as the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion, to reach global markets. By selling more oil to Asia and Europe, the country could reduce its dependence on U.S. buyers, making future trade disputes less of a threat. Beyond oil, Canada also looked to strengthen its domestic energy industry. Investments in renewable power and efficiency upgrades aimed to make the country less reliant on fossil fuel exports altogether. This shift aligned with Canada's broader environmental goals, providing both economic and climate benefits. Meanwhile, the tariff dispute wasn't just playing out between the U.S. and Canada. Mexico also found itself caught in the crossfire. Trump's proposed tariffs on Mexican imports, which he claimed were necessary to curb migration and the flow of fentanyl, sparked immediate backlash. Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum warned that if these tariffs were enacted, Mexico would respond in kind. Retaliatory tariffs on American goods were on the table, raising the risk of a full-scale trade war. She cautioned that this tit-for-tat approach would ultimately hurt businesses on both sides of the border. To reduce its vulnerability, Mexico launched its Mexico First initiative, aimed at increasing domestic production and cutting reliance on foreign imports. The strategy focused on industries like automotive manufacturing and aerospace, ensuring that Mexico could withstand external economic pressures. At the same time, officials in Mexico pointed out that Trump's tariffs could backfire on the U.S. economy. Because American and Mexican industries were so deeply connected, any disruption in trade could cost the U.S. hundreds of thousands of jobs, especially in manufacturing. Farmers, too, had reason to be concerned. Mexico was a top buyer of American agricultural products like corn, soybeans, and beef. If tariffs were imposed, U.S. farmers could see demand plummet, putting their livelihoods at risk. Beyond North America, another major player in global trade, China, was closely watching the situation unfold. As another frequent target of U.S. tariffs, Chinese officials signaled that they could limit or halt exports to the U.S., redirecting trade flows to Europe, Asia, and Africa instead. The economic stakes were high, with the U.S.-China trade volume reaching nearly $600 billion in 2023. America's trade deficit with China had ballooned to $350 billion, fueling tensions between the two superpowers. Meanwhile, when it came to energy, Canada remained the U.S.'s most important crude oil supplier. By 2023, Canada was providing over 50% of all U.S. crude imports, a number that had steadily increased over the past decade. The reason? U.S. refineries, particularly in the Midwest and Gulf Coast, were designed to process the heavier crude extracted from Canada's oil sands. This deep energy dependence meant that any disruption in oil trade between the two countries wouldn't just be an inconvenience. It could send shockwaves through the American energy sector. The flow of trade between the United States and its top partners, Canada, Mexico, China, and the European Union, has long been the backbone of the global economy. But with the introduction of aggressive new tariff proposals, that system is now facing unprecedented strain. Canada, America's largest crude oil supplier, sent an estimated $97 billion worth of oil to the U.S. in 2023 alone, covering roughly 62% of total imports. Meanwhile, Mexico, the second largest supplier, shipped in around 42 million barrels per day. However, concerns about Mexico's declining oil production and shifting domestic policies have raised questions about its long-term ability to maintain these exports. Amid these shifting dynamics, the White House's proposed trade policies are sending shockwaves across industries. A series of steep tariffs targeting Canada, Mexico, and China have triggered widespread alarm, with experts warning of economic turmoil if these measures are enforced. Given how deeply interconnected modern supply chains have become, any disruption in trade could have far-reaching consequences, setting off a chain reaction of retaliatory policies from affected nations. In response to the proposed tariffs, Canada has begun weighing its options. One of the most drastic possibilities on the table? Restricting oil exports to the U.S. If that were to happen, states like Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota, heavily dependent on Canadian energy, would be hit the hardest. A reduced oil supply could cause fuel prices to skyrocket, driving up costs for consumers and businesses alike. Beyond energy, Canada is also considering retaliatory tariffs on key American goods, a strategy it has used in past trade disputes. U.S. exports of steel, aluminum, and agricultural products, such as wheat, pork, and dairy, could all face new restrictions, making American producers vulnerable to revenue losses. With over $1.1 trillion in total trade between the two countries in 2023, any economic conflict between Canada and the U.S. would have significant consequences on both sides of the border. Meanwhile, Mexico has also signaled its intention to fight back. Officials have warned that imposing a 25% tariff on Mexican imports would be a massive miscalculation, potentially leading to job losses in the U.S., numbering in the hundreds of thousands. The automotive industry would be particularly hard hit, since car parts frequently cross the U.S.-Mexico border multiple times before final assembly. Any additional trade barriers could bring production to a halt. Another vulnerable sector, U.S. agriculture. Mexico is one of the biggest buyers of American-grown corn, soybeans, and meat. Any increase in tariffs could weaken demand, leading to excess supply and plummeting prices for American farmers. Beyond North America, China is also preparing for potential trade retaliation. A frequent target of U.S. tariff policies, China has hinted that it may cut off or restrict key exports, including electronics, industrial machinery, and rare earth materials, resources essential to American manufacturing. With trade between the two countries totaling $600 billion in 2023, any escalation in tariffs could further deepen tensions between the world's two largest economies. The European Union, another major trading partner, is also watching the situation closely. With US-EU trade surpassing $1.2 trillion in 2023, European leaders are considering their own countermeasures should these new tariffs be enacted. Past disputes over steel and aluminum tariffs have shown that the EU isn't afraid to hit back, often targeting high-profile American products like bourbon, motorcycles, and agricultural goods. In a worst-case scenario, the EU could use its influence in global trade to encourage other countries to take similar action against the US, isolating it from key economic relationships and making American businesses less competitive on the international stage. The ripple effects of a full-scale trade war would be enormous. Key industries, including agriculture, technology, and manufacturing, would face rising costs, supply chain bottlenecks, and potential layoffs. Consumer prices would likely rise, as businesses pass increased costs onto shoppers. Economic forecasts suggest that prolonged tariff conflicts could even slow down U.S. GDP growth, further straining the domestic economy. As tensions mount, global markets are bracing for uncertainty.